All right. Hi, my name is Danielle Lynch, for those of you that don't know me, and I'm the Assistant Director of Domestic Violence Advocacy at the YWCA. So I work within the Palomar building and collaborate with a lot of different other partners and agencies, and I'll be introducing each of the panelists. So I'll introduce each of them and allow them to share a little bit about their work and their background that they do. Our first panelist, just going in the order of the screen, is Auziah Antwine, who is an attorney at law.
Yes, Auziah Antwine. Thank you, Danielle. I recently just did about 1.5 years with Palomar in the domestic violence unit. My primary occupation was providing legal assistance for victims, and that included family law, victim protective orders, and assisting them actually with some of their criminal cases as well, where they were victims and the abusers were being prosecuted, and just providing some clarity on that. So helping victims is already a part of my early on legal career.
All right, well, thank you for joining us today. Our next panelist is Aurelius Miles Francisco, who is with the Foundation for Liberating Minds and Against Carceral Feminism. I cannot talk today, that's a bad sign.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Danielle and Sydney and YWCA-OKC for putting on this event. Really excited to dig into this conversation. As Danielle said, I'm the co-executive director with Foundation for Liberating Minds, which is a community nonprofit based in Oklahoma City. We do work around dismantling systems of oppression through transformative education. And one of the programs of Foundation for Liberating Minds is Against Carceral Feminism Oklahoma, which is a collective of organizers and survivors, advocates, and community members who are interested in the project of prison industrial complex abolition and in working against carceral feminism. Just real briefly, so everybody's like on the same page, what carceral feminism is. Carceral feminism locates the solution to gender-based violence, so domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking in the carceral system. So sees the solution or the proper response to domestic violence in policing and in prisons and in prosecution and in punishment, the punishment apparatus. And so this collective is working against that and really looking at the ways that we can provide true safety and true accountability for survivors of domestic violence. So happy to be here today and to dig into this important conversation.
All right. And our next panelist is Richard Sturt, who is with Serve the People.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Richard Sturt. I run Serve the People along with some other folks. I also run an organization called the Hope Initiative, which is, as of right now, the only active harm reduction program working out of Oklahoma City.
All right. And our last panelist is Paula Schonauer, who is a licensed clinical social worker.
Thank you, Danielle. And I'm also a retired police officer, so I've worked on the end of in the criminal justice system dealing with domestics. And during my career as a police officer that ended 7 years ago, when I retired, I saw the evolution of police response to domestics, and that what Aurelius Francisco was talking about, that movement towards that equality of especially in regards to the Domestic Abuse Act, where women and men were both subject to that. And then also the systemic lack of response in among many of my former colleagues in domestic situations, because women who endure the domestic abuse cycle find themselves in bad relationship after bad relationship unless they have an effective intervention. And sometimes the callers for these domestics were often the same people, and that would reduce the amount of empathy or care that police officers would take in those situations. So, yeah, I'm here to offer what I've witnessed in the perspective of that.
Well, thank you again to all of our panelists for agreeing to be here and to share that information with us. And those of you, you are welcome to ask the panelists questions as well. You can send them in the chat, or you can direct message myself if it's something that you don't feel comfortable including in the chat. If you've been to any of the other panels, we do have some questions prepared, but we welcome them from the public as well. So we will get started. So I'll read out a question, and then just whoever wants to take it, you can piggyback off of each other and share as much as you want. So our first question is just going to be, what are some reasons that a survivor may not want to interact with law enforcement?
I'll try to tackle this one. So a lot of the clients that I had that came in to Palomar, one thing, there seems to be a connection between lower income, lower educational status, and your propensity to be abused. And so some would describe it as a lot of our victims are not coming in with what we would call clean hands. They have a criminal history. They already have a background of having negative experiences with the police. They already have a background of being culturally ignored. And so there already exists this kind of dynamic of anti-government, anti-establishment, anti-help, to where they don't even really trust us when they come in, and we are kind of seen as a last resort. So any mention of doing a DV&E report or sitting down with a detective, it already puts them in kind of this defensive mode, because for their entire lives, they have been told they are the problem. And unfortunately, there hasn't really been a great system put in place to kind of mend that relationship with law enforcement, for them to feel like if they tell their story, they will be heard. And that's just the honest truth.
I'll jump in here. You know, there are any myriad of reasons, you know, why survivors may not want to involve law enforcement with their case. You know, some being fear of retaliation from their abuser, fear of losing income or housing that may be tied to the perpetrator of their abuse. And then one important thing that I think should be noted why survivors may not come forward to law enforcement with their experience is a fear of not being believed because of what you were just talking about. They aren't the perfect victim. And there's this narrative that is really endemic in our culture, in our culture and society, that is, you know, definitely a reality within the culture of policing around what we think of when we think of a victim. And so for a lot of victims who don't fit into this mold of a cisgender, petite, like white woman, right, who is seen as somebody who could actually be victimized, right? So for Black women, you know, for Indigenous women, for survivors who may be involved in sex work or who may be poor, right? They don't fit into this narrative of the perfect victim. And then they often find themselves, because they don't fit into this narrative of the perfect victim, they find themselves being criminalized in that situation and are often arrested themselves, right? Because we do have, you know, in Oklahoma, often like this need in domestic calls to a mandatory arrest, right? You have to arrest somebody when you have the specific call. And so in these situations, sometimes the people who are arrested are the victims themselves. And then you also have the reality that, you know, there's estimates out there that nearly 40% of police officers are perpetrators, right, of domestic violence. And so you also have the reality that you have a good chance that the police officer who is coming out to hear your story, who you are relying on to provide some semblance of safety or justice, is a perpetrator of that same form of abuse that you've experienced. And that can just, again, sort of continue that cycle of trauma and of abuse.
Right, yeah, if I can piggyback off that, I mean, so obviously we have the 40% and then the 60% who are well aware of that 40% and do nothing. So at the very least, we may not be getting an abuser, but someone who is still complicit in the silence of that. Like for me personally, some of you all may have been in on the panel I spoke on last week about being a male survivor of domestic violence. So I have that perspective to add to this conversation as well, which is kind of why I'm here. Also, one of the people who helped raise me, my uncle, was murdered by police, which is a reason why in that situation, I'm never going to call the cops. Unfortunately, especially in BIPOC communities and in working class and poor communities, quite a few people have that same experience. It's a heartbreaking reality, but that's just the way it is. And then also on the flip side of that, again, from my experience, and if the roles were reversed, if it wasn't a femme being my abuser, but vice versa, I can imagine there'd be a fear to call the police in that situation, that the abuser may be killed by police. All it takes is an argument, things get out of hand, and that's that. I mean, while obviously we want people to get out of abusive situations, they still, I think in a lot of situations, do not want to see their abuser killed in front of them or at all.
All right. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to that discussion? There's a lot of really powerful.
One of the things that that people are also hesitant to call law enforcement in a domestic violence situation is because of the lack of empathy that officers have. Even when they're going through the right thing, you know, doing the right things as far as what they're legally required to do, a lot of officers treat the people involved like it's a waste of their time, because they feel like, well, you know, the person who's the victim is going to drop charges anyway, and I would rather not be out here responding to things like this. And then that's on the better end of the spectrum in police response. But then there's also actual open hostility toward the not only the victims, not only the perpetrator, but also the victim, because, you know, why can't you get your life together, or why don't you move, or why don't you divorce? Like, it's like all these things are so easy to do, especially when people are struggling with poverty and having the means to access services that could help aid a separation. And so there's just not a whole lot of empathy. Now, there's been efforts to try to build that in. When getting domestic calls about the time I was retiring, there was a study being done, and there was a hotline to call and stuff like that. And it would be, you know, it would seem that it would improve police response, because it would be identifying the victim, giving the victim some knowledge about support and services available. But sometimes these were seen by a lot of rank and file officers as just a bunch of hoops we have to jump through, wasting more of our time. what officers would rather be doing. I don't know. It depends on the officer, but they'd rather be going car to car somewhere or talking, you know, going to a wrecker place and talking, or maybe going out and looking for a drug bust or a stolen car to get into a pursuit or something like that. But domestics and automobile accidents are low on the totem pole for the kind of calls officers want to spend their time on. And domestic abuse situations are considered one of those things that, a quote that I heard a lot was, can go to hell in a handbasket real quick. And so because of that mentality, and it does reflect a certain truth sometimes, but officers go into these situations hyper vigilant and expecting violence. So and with that kind of response, you know, the officers scare people.
Before we get to the question and comments, to piggyback off of some of the things that you all were sharing, what are some options that survivors have when they do have that negative response from law enforcement?
So this is also the sucky part, right? Because I want to be able to say, you always have the law at your disposal, and you can always file a civil litigation against, you know, when you are clearly being discriminated against for whatever reason, when you're telling your story and officers are not doing their job. This is just not the reality, because most victims do not have these kind of resources. This is when I always talk about institutions like the ACLU. This is when I talk about Palomar and how we offer our services to victims and represent them in court and get them their protective orders. But in the least, what victims can always do is file a formal complaint. Will that complaint always take notice? No, it won't. I'm not going to lie to you. But what it does is set a precedent, so that when the next victim and the next victim is completely ignored by the same detective or the same officer, there starts to become a pattern. And it's much similar to the pattern that we establish against abusers. I often hear victims say, well, you know, nothing's going to happen. I filed my VPO, but it was denied, or I filed my VPO and I didn't get an emergency protective order. It was only set for hearing. Do it anyway, because the whole system is about creating awareness where when the abuse lies, and that includes officers. So I always encourage anyone who has been in a situation where they felt like, you know, the very people who are meant to serve them are not doing their jobs. Make a note of it, make a record of it, make history, because that history can come back later and create change.
I'd also just quickly add that those means within the system are definitely important, but I also think searching for means outside of the system and community-based organizations, and, you know, especially community organizers and advocates who are doing work around police accountability, around defund the police, around you know, police abolition, around police reform, whatever it is, who are really working to you know, hold police to account to the injustices that they engage in our community, and to sort of bring that their story right to the fore in a number of ways. Oftentimes that pressure outside of the system really forces the system, police institutions, and otherwise to actually act on some of those things. And so I think in a pool of very few options, when the people who are supposed to be protecting you are the ones who are, you know, causing you harm, sometimes, you know, a good option is to engage with organizations and community members who are doing the work to hold police accountable.
And I'd just like to emphasize the formal complaint part of it, because sometimes when people, will complain, they'll say, I want to talk to your supervisor. And then that supervisor is supposed to go ahead and do an investigation and everything and then write a report about it, but that doesn't always happen. So requesting a formal complaint takes it out of the particular shift or patrol division, and then into what used to be called internal affairs, which is police standards. And so it will be more likely investigated. The outcome, as stated, won't necessarily be meaningful, but it will be on record.
So it sounds to me, because I think everybody just made some really amazing points, that the biggest answer is to do it all. To work within the, really shitty system, and also outside of it, to try to make some justice using all of it.
Before we move to the next question, anybody else have anything they want to add? Okay. So why do y'all think that police officers are more likely to harm their partners than non-police officers are?
Oh, I have clients who were married to police officers who are abusing them. And the easiest answer is power and control. They have the resource to manipulate the system. They're a part of the good old boys club. And they really just kind of move through space believing that they don't have to answer for the things that they've done. Now, that's not always true, but we know where it comes from. You know what I mean? We can feel that they're getting this sense of power and authority from an institution that was created without thinking about victims. So any victim that I ever had who was either married to or involved with someone that was in law enforcement easily felt like, how can I do this? How? Because it's not just me going against him, it's me going against an entire system. That can be very overwhelming for a victim.
Another thing that contributes is the stigma around seeking mental health care in law enforcement. And so officers, if they've been first responders to a traumatic incident, will often just try to tough through it and then not get help that they need to be able to process what they've experienced. And then the longer they wait, a traumatic reaction starts to become a post-traumatic reaction. And then when triggered, oftentimes because of the police culture, will often act out violently. And oftentimes when they do so, it's against the domestic partner. And I'm not going to say that explains all of the domestic abuse that police officers perpetuate on their partners, but that is some of it. There are a number of officers who get into the profession for exactly that power control, and they feel like they're above the fray when it comes to things. But when anyone is placed in a situation where they feel vulnerable, they're not encouraged to by the culture to seek help. And if they do, and people find out about it, they're often looked down upon, and it could hurt their career. And then Unfortunately, now I'm going by when I was officer 7 years ago. Confidentiality was not assured if an officer was seeking to get into the employee assistance program. Had to go through the supervisor, and the supervisors weren't always, they had no professional obligation to keep this confidential, keep this confidential. And if the person was seen as a troublemaker seeking help, or someone that was considered different or a malcontent, the supervisors definitely broke confidentiality. So and so went and needs to take
Looks like her screen froze. Will we give it a second? Does anybody have anything they want to add to that question?
I kind of want to add to what Kenzie wrote in the group chat. Outside of other organizations that have already been mentioned, and Palomar, ACLU, that kind of stuff, I just want to make sure people know that you can file a victim's protective order anywhere. That's one of the biggest graces that the law provides for victims, is that if you feel like your abuser is kind of supported in the society in which you are in currently, I could, if I was a victim and my husband abuser was a Oklahoma City PD, I can go to Florida, I can go to Texas, I can go to Kansas, and the day I arrive, I can file a protective order against him. And he would not have the exact same kind of support that he would in Oklahoma, because those officers don't know him. He's not a part of that community. And jurisdiction is not a requirement in the way that it works in other areas of the law. That's one thing that the law got right for abusers, is we can leave toxic environments and immediately seek some kind of protection. So I just wanted to make that clear for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on it, excuse me, perfectly, about power and control. It's all about the culture of policing that leads to, a disproportionate number of cops being perpetrators of domestic violence. In that so often, all of the violence that police officers can get away with in their day-to-day job duties within communities of color and within poor communities, that same feeling of being above the law, of being able to do what they will, ekes into the home and with their partners or with their children, right? And so it's all about that cultural aspect. And then to the other question about sort of when police officers are perpetrators of domestic violence, we had a very public case in Oklahoma City with the police officer, Danielle Holtzclaw, who had sexually assaulted and abused numerous women on the east side of Oklahoma City over years. And I think oftentimes when we think about the case of Danielle Holtzclaw, we think about that as some form of justice was served because he got like multiple life sentences, right? But I think what we really have to think about is again, we're like here with YWCA, thinking about like violence prevention and actually like interruption. Like, what does prevention look like for the violence of police officers, right? And so that's why I really think there's an important piece of reframing like defund the police as a survivor-led violence interruption campaign, right? Because as long as police officers have the domain and the resources to terrorize communities and to do what they will without any semblance of accountability, these forms of violence will continue to stack on top of each other, right? And so when we think about the resources that domestic violence survivors need, right, those resources are being looted by our police departments in Oklahoma City and in Tulsa, right? We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars being funneled into these police institutions to provide safety for survivors, when in reality, so many of them are perpetrators of those same forms. And, so often those resources getting put into police offices where survivors could really use housing or really use assistance, with, finding a living wage and things of that nature. And so I think that aspect of really pushing sort of like these individual cases to a larger societal push around where are our priorities as a city, as a state, and as a country, as it relates to safety for survivors, will really look to end defund the police and abolitionist campaigns as violence interruption and survivor-led campaigns.
Yeah, if I may for a moment. Yeah, I love the reframing that a bit. And I'm glad you brought up Holdslaw, because that was the next point that I was going to make, is not only did that happen, but then they put up a damn billboard on the east side, like right after he was found guilty, about Daniel Holdslaw is innocent, right where the survivors are going to be seeing that shit every day, which is in itself an act of violence. And seeing that, like, as a survivor, like, why would we ever trust the police with that? And then also on that same topic, like, so Palomar and I think the YWCA had a event on the lawn of the Capitol, maybe 2-3 years ago, where some people spoke. I think Kendra Horn spoke, and someone from the police department. Meanwhile, there are two cops sitting right in front of me, snickering the entire time. Like, I'm not sure why, like, this is even that much of a question. That's like why this is an issue when the cops still refuse to do anything about it, which plays hand in hand as to why we need, I want to say reform, but in reality, we need abolition.
Anybody else have anything that they want to share on any of those aspects? Okay. So we'll move on to the next question. And it's similar, but what are some reasons that a survivor may not want to reach out to a victim service agency?
So I want to preface this with saying that being in public service is difficult. And it's a very specific type of job that not everyone can do. But we do it. Some of the reasons why, and this is just through talking with some of my victims, why it took them so long, is that they didn't see people that were relatable in service. I had a lot of my victims say, wow, you look like me. And there seems to be a connection for them. There's trust, especially when we're talking about people of color, especially women of color. And so I think that diversity comes into play. I have a lot of victims who are not legal citizens. They are afraid of being deported. And then I would just go back to that overall distrust of anything that looks governmental, anything that looks too structured. And especially when we are making certain recommendations to them that they have never had to think about before. If I think about the questionnaire form that we do with victims, are you living with your abuser? Do you share a bank account with your abuser? Those questions are scary to them. And I think it's a difficult balance trying to find a way of getting the information we need without alarming them, without making them feel like they're being put on the spot. And coming from Palomar, I know that we're doing the best we can. We think about everything, including the rooms that we bring them into, neutral colors, having places for their children to be while we're talking business. I mean, it's just really hard because when you're dealing with people who have been perpetually abused, they don't trust anyone. And so you spend so much time just kind of having them lower their guard so that we can help them. So I think it's totally normal. And I think the only thing that we can do is to keep thinking of innovative ways that are therapeutic to help victims kind of relax and go, okay, I can trust this process. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a key piece, right? That survivors often don't see themselves in the people who are working for many of these organizations. That's a key piece of it. And then another key piece is that a lot of these organizations are deeply intertwined, interlocked with police officers. And I mean, not even like they have them on speed dial, right? But police officers are actually working in the same buildings that survivors are coming to get help, right? And so for survivors, particularly for marginalized survivors, for Black survivors, for Indigenous survivors, for queer and trans survivors, for undocumented survivors, right, whose communities have a historical distrust and valid indignation with the institution of policing, seeing cops in the organization that you're coming to for help or for assistance is an immediate turnoff, right? That place isn't safe for me. That place isn't somewhere where I can actually get help. And so I think that is the biggest area that a lot of these organizations, and for some organizations, right, this is an intentional practice. And for others, it is a practice that they are forced upon because of federal oversight, right? When we think about VAWA and the amount of, again, funding and resources that gets funneled into law enforcement, there is almost a forced relationship between organizations and law enforcement agencies. And so I think a key piece of this for, domestic violence advocacy organizations, for victim service agencies, is to really begin the intentional process of divesting from the carceral system writ large and from policing especially, and to be brave in sort of those organizations' pushback against a continual reliance on policing, when we have seen over and over and over again that not only do police officers, not only does prisons and jails not provide safety for survivors and for victims, or provide any semblance of accountability for perpetrators of domestic violence or sexual assault, right? But it's actually causing more and more harm. And so that divestment from the system, I think, is absolutely crucial for survivors writ large, who already have, as you stated, right, this distrust of governmental agencies, to begin feeling like these entities are there to support them and to provide safety for them.
Yeah, for me, there was two things I wanted to add. One, like, as a male survivor of domestic violence, like, for one thing, I'm a really big dude. I've worked as a bodyguard and security my entire life. I now own a company that does both those things. I'm going to go tell someone that I'm being abused and expect to be believed? Like, come on. And then another completely different thing on the same topic, Oklahoma House Bill 1804, which was signed in 2007, hasn't really been enforced, but it's still on the books, makes it a felony to provide any kind of healthcare, education, or even a ride to someone suspected of being in the country illegally. There was a huge amount of fear over that bill, which, by the way, was signed into law by a Democrat. Like, a huge amount of fear that still exists. So a lot of people just aren't going to come get the help they need because of these bullshit laws on the books written by terrible people who still run the state today.
And Cindy added in the comments, for those of you that didn't see, that 80% of VAWA funding goes to law enforcement. Anybody else have anything they want to add for that question? What are some concerns that may come out during the victim's protection order process that clients might not be aware of, or issues that stem from that process?
A lot of victims don't understand the process at all, just in general. So I'll say it. You are abused, you come to Palomar, or you go to the courthouse, you want a victim's protective order, they have you fill out a petition, you file it. I already told you before the Zoom started, a lot of victims do not present the best petition, and they don't understand that the judge, whoever the sitting judge is on that docket, get hundreds and hundreds of those petitions a day. They're skimming really quickly and making a decision and going to the next one. What are those decisions? They can deny it outright. When you deny it outright, it means that there just wasn't enough substance in the petition for me to say as a judge, okay, this person needs protection now. And sometimes that seems a little harsh, but I couldn't tell you how many times on a Palomar application we get, he stabbed, he choked, he hurt, he beat, but then we read the petition that the judge saw and it says, oh, we were together for this long. It was good at first, now it's bad, I need help. So they've told me all the abuse, but then they didn't tell the judge anything. And then the judge denies it outright. Another way, and something else that can happen, is that the judge will go, there may be enough information here for a protective order, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to set it for hearing, and I'm not going to grant what we call an emergency protective order. An emergency protective order protects the victim now. Before we hear anything from the abuser, we defer to you, victim, and say, you need help, we're going to do an emergency protective order. If there's not enough information there, then the judge can't do that. And then lastly, let's say the victim did write enough in their petition and judge goes, okay, this warrants an emergency protective order. They grant the emergency protective order, abuser is served. Now we have the hearing to see if that emergency protective order will turn into a final order, and the victim is entirely unprepared. No witnesses, no text messages, no pictures, no timeline. And so victims think it's enough, and right, no fault of their own. They've already been abused. A lot of them feel like, what more do you want from me? I went through this long process. I show up, I say, these are the things he did to me. And the judge is like, but where? He or she. These are the things he or she did to me. Where's the proof? And so some things that are alarming to victims about this process is being reoffended by having to tell the story over and over again. I told it to my attorney. I told it to the judge. I told it to the detective. They're done. They're so done. And so by the time they're at the end of that process, they feel like they don't have anything. I've literally had a victim tell me, oh my God, he is the one that hurt me. Why do I have to go file the order? Why do I have to do all these things? And then when I try to explain to them due process and how in this country, you're not guilty until you've either been tried by a jury of your peers, or in a non-jury case, a judge makes a decision, they're just done with it. And so, unfortunately, I think this also leads to a lot of victims returning back to abusers and all sorts of things. Did I answer that question? I feel like I just start, because I have a lot of thoughts on this, like on how we can make this part of the system better so that victims aren't completely blindsided when they start going through this process.
Another thing is that sometimes victims are reluctant to file because of the filing fees, and then oftentimes once the judge grants a victim protection order, the full amount of the filing fees will be assigned to the perpetrator a lot of the time, but not all the time. And so sometimes that is an impediment. And then another thing too is that sometimes either officers don't care, or well, they're trained well enough. It's that they don't care, that when a victim protection order is violated, they are required to make a report and/or an arrest. Period. It doesn't matter if there's new evidence. It's a court order to arrest, and then that person has to be taken in and go in front of the judge and explain why they violated the parameters of the victim protection order. But there's a lot of times officers walk away from it and do not make the arrest or let the perpetrator go and not make any report at all, and that undermines the trust in a very important factor that can be a protective factor for victims.
And all of this gets at like the reason why half of survivors don't report and don't use this system, right? Is just how arduous this process through the courts is to get a simple protective order against your abuser, right? Like just how, how much help and assistance is needed to get the protection that you are often needing in that immediate moment, right? And so to me, all of this is pointing to the question of not so much how can we make the system work better for survivors, because the conclusion that I've come to, and the conclusion that I think a lot of people have come to, a lot of survivors and a lot of particularly abolitionists have come to, is that this system isn't as tricky and as confusing and as difficult and as harmful and as traumatic as it is by accident. The system is working exactly as it was intended to. The system wasn't built to protect survivors, right? The system wasn't built to hold perpetrators of intimate partner violence to account, right? And so our questions should revolve around what are the structures, what are the systems, what is the culture that we can build up outside of the system that can actually provide true safety? I know there's a question around like, okay, what options would there be outside? So I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I just think all of this like points to the fact that just how difficult it is, right? And oftentimes, like when we're leading trainings on, gender-based violence prevention in front of folks, and when somebody discloses to you that they were, victimized by abuse, what should you do? And the first thing is to believe them, right? And just how all of this flies in the face of just that very simple truth that all advocates believe in, is to believe somebody who comes forward, that they're not lying to you and that they're telling you the truth, right? And this system revolves around needing evidence and needing facts, needing more than just your word of mouth, you saying that this happened to you. That isn't enough. I need evidence. I need pictures. I need a scar. I need, right? And how all of that can be deeply, deeply traumatic for survivors.
And if it's okay, Danielle, I wanted to also address, I believe it's Brenna, I think I'm saying her name right, which she wrote in here about having to have a police report in court to get the VPO. So just some clarity on that. When a decision is made on a final order, oh, can everybody hear me? My computer's doing something weird. Okay. So when a decision is made on a final victims protective order, and let's say the judge says, I believe that this person deserves an order. There's two boxes that are checked. The first box is this order is because of domestic violence. The second box is this order is because of stalking or harassment. And they're two completely different assessments. As far as needing a police report to get a victim protective order, that only applies when you have not met a relationship status for it to be considered domestic violence. And I just want to say, I don't agree with any of this, but this is the legislation that we have. So legislators have decided if you are abused by your boyfriend, your husband, your lover, someone that you are intimate with, or a family member, that is domestic violence. Anything else is stalking and harassment, and that goes into a different assessment. So what does that look like? I had a victim that came in and said, hey, my boss is harassing me. In addition to filing some kind of sexual assault civil case, and then also calling the police to have that looked at, maybe that can turn into criminal charges. I want a protective order against this person. I have quit my job. I now don't want to see this person. Well, what do we have? He's not the boyfriend. He's not the brother. He's not a husband. He doesn't qualify under the domestic violence sector. So now I have to start thinking about stalking and harassment. Okay, I need a police report. Really? Yes, really. I need a police report. Okay, I filed a police report. Okay, now I need a copy of it. And that's when all the loops and dips and turns, I don't know what it is because I don't see that side of it, but I can attest it is extremely difficult for victims to get a hold of police reports. I don't know why. So then we're in front of the judge and judge feels like if you really wanted this or if you really needed this, you would have this here. And then I have to step in as the attorney, actually judge. I know she's called. I know she's gone in person. I don't know what the holdup is, but at this point I'm ready to issue a subpoena because I don't know why we can't get a copy of the police report. But so I just wanted to add and make a distinction between when it's needed and when it's not. If I'm abused by an intimate partner or a family member, you do not need a police report. You can go, you can file, and that is enough. Something needs to change, and I think that it has to happen at the legislative level because I don't think anybody should need a police report. If someone is stalking you, abusing you, harassing you, you should be able to seek legal recourse without having that.
Anyone else have anything they want to add about BPOs?
I'd like to add also that generally, I don't know if there's any exceptions now, but they only last 3 years. And for especially egregious issues, that could be, re-traumatizing every time someone has to go reapply for another victim protection order.
So they.
Oh,
You go ahead, Auziah.
Again, sorry, just this is kind of like, so the legal aspect of it. So statutorily, a VPO can last up to 5 years unless very extreme circumstances, and I've done several of these already, you can get a lifetime order. And in order to have a lifetime order statutorily, there's a whole list of things that have to be met, but it does happen. And yes, to your point, whenever you get a VPO and it expires, and that person some abusers are really, they will wait, and the hour that order has expired, there they are. And what we do, it's a whole new process again. You file, you use the original order to say, this is what I got last time. And then normally what will happen is that will turn into a lifetime order. So that's the system saying, okay, we said, don't contact this person, don't be around this person 3 or 5 years. It expired, and now you're back. Clearly you haven't learned your lesson. Now it's a lifetime order. Surprisingly, and not to be critical of victims because they're going through their own things, I get frustrated because victims get the order and then they don't use it. And that it breaks my heart because when you have a final order in place, it essentially says this person cannot contact you for any reason. There are nuances when you have children with that person, but for the most part, that's it. And so you'll get a message on Facebook. I tell my victims, I don't care if it's a heart. I don't care what it is. If they contact you when that order is in place, call the police. They will be arrested. They will be put in jail, and they'll suffer the consequences of violating that order. But with my victims, I get, well, it was just a heart, but he said something nice. Now he wants to meet. Maybe everything's okay now. And so I've done all I could do on the legal side of it to get you the order that you need, but now you're not implementing it. And before we know it, we're back in the same place. And then what often happens too, when that order is in place, is victims will have their own order vacated. And it really just shows you the power struggle here. It shows you the dynamic. I think in addition to all of the services that the public sector offers, there should be therapy as well. And I know that exists, but I think that what we don't do a really great job at is enforcing, like, I almost wish that it could be like, when you're ready, when you want this order, you also have to do therapy, because this happens more often than not.
And then is there still the, unless there's an emergency order issued, the order cannot be enforced until the perpetrator is served. And some people are very good at ducking process servers. So another systemic loophole that someone can exploit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's also something that's draining for our victims, because when the abuser is not served, they get what's called an alias order, and they have to check up on it every 6 months to see if that person has been served. And again, I mean, the system is very flawed, because then our victims just kind of go, this is too much. And then they're no longer interested in protecting themselves.
So we pointed out a lot of kind of concerns with VPOs and why people may not want to use that or have barriers into using VPOs as a system. According to some of the stats that were gathered by Palomar, only about 2% of people who commit domestic violence even ever receive any prison time. So what are some alternatives for justice? So that's 98% of the domestic violence domestic abuse survivors that are not getting assistance through the criminal justice system, through these systems that are put into place. What are some options that they might have?
Yeah, I mean, and I think like this is, so what I'm gonna describe may seem like pretty like theoretical, or like this can happen in the future, but this is very much happening right now, right? Survivors and their networks, their family and friends are finding safety and are finding protection outside of the system currently, every day, right? That they're experiencing these things. And so I think, first of all, it's important to note that there isn't one singular thing that can replace this entire system to provide safety and to provide protection for survivors. But there are numerous things that have to occur, right? So, you know, there has to be the proper resources and channels to access those resources for survivors. So again, going back to this same core concept around funding and resources at the governmental level that needs to be there, right? And then also, there has to be networks of community accountability across the communities that survivors are experiencing these things. And so, you know, one core sort of framework for this is transformative justice, right? Which looks at it really is a survivor-centered method in providing accountability for the perpetrator of that harm, and then in providing safety and true justice for the survivor, right? And so transformative justice really is all about providing safety and justice for whatever that looks like for that survivor. And oftentimes it is ensuring that separation, what we were talking about right then with VPOs, but without the courts, right? Providing separation and ensuring that they won't run into their abuser again, right? And so what are the networks within our own circles that can actually ensure that we don't have to, that survivor doesn't have to run into the abuser? And I think another important reframe for us, and I may be preaching to the choir here, is that the majority of abusers of domestic violence are people that we know, right? They are our friends, they are our family, they are an acquaintance of a friend, right? They are people that we know. And so when we think about, you know, providing that separation or that safety for the survivor, that is very much so in the ability of the people in our networks, our friends and our family. And so pod mapping is one thing that transformative justice practitioners do a lot, which is really just a practice of, if violence or harm happened to me, who are the core people that I'm going to rely on or that I'm going to call to help me out in that situation so that I'm prepared when these things happen? And then where are the resources that can actually help to provide accountability to my perpetrator? Because a lot of survivors actually don't want their perpetrator, who may be a partner of theirs, who they love dearly, to be in prison, right? Now, even if they do, we know that like less than 1% of people who are accused actually end up behind bars. But oftentimes, that's not even an option that survivors want, right? But they do want them to not continue to abuse them, right? And so transformative justice and restorative justice are really good ways to actually bring about true accountability without punishment. And so there are some organizations in Oklahoma who, are doing this work right now. I, along with Foundation for Liberating Minds, alongside the Restorative Justice Institute of Oklahoma, have been training a lot of community members across the state around these very same tenets and practices to really address violence and harm in our communities without the system. And so I think that's like one key piece is what can safety look like that isn't rooted in punishment?
I want to mention, kind of to piggyback on everything you said, other things like the address confidentiality program. That's huge for a lot of my victims. It's not fair that our victims need to change their names. It's not fair that sometimes they need to leave their communities, but it's the reality of the situation, especially when we're talking about the percentage of abusers that actually return and kill their victims. So things of that nature, name changes, address confidentiality. And then also, I don't want to forget, we don't want to forget that VPO, that process was specifically created for victims in conjunction with the criminal law sector, but also the burden of proof is entirely different. In order for an abuser to go to prison for what they did, that's beyond a reasonable doubt. But ours is preponderance of the evidence. So in a civil litigation of VPO, that abuser, you can have a final protective order against that abuser, even though they didn't go to jail. And so that is something positive about the system, even though it's not perfect. Just because the abuser didn't get arrested or didn't go to prison doesn't mean you can't get your order against them. I do think that's important to know. So I just wanted to add that.
Anyone else want to add to that question? So the next question, we'll move on. What are some of the parallels between how the criminal justice system operates and some of the power and control tactics that are used by perpetrators of domestic violence?
I feel like I'm talking too much. I'm sorry, guys. The criminal justice system, and we really don't want it to be a different way. Law school teaches us that this is the right way, but we defer to defendants. We defer to potentially abusers. Our criminal justice system is about protecting the innocent. We'd rather see 1 million guilty people go free than one innocent person be imprisoned. And so to the detriment of our victims have to do more than they should to get the protection they need. When we look at law enforcement, I kind of look at it the same way, where more is asked from our victims to prove themselves. They have to think about not getting in trouble. We have to think about officers thinking that, oh, this was mutual combat, as opposed to it was me being victimized. I do see a lot of similarities between the two. And to be honest, I'm not really sure what the antidote is, because again, do I want a system? I want a system where victims are automatically protected, but also there is deference given to the innocent. I know that the system we have is not exactly there, but as a young attorney, I'm not quite sure how to fix that. without us being heavy into legislation. And if we look culturally, we're just, I mean, we are not a voting society. I know we act like we are, but we're not. If it's not the presidential election, people are not voting the way that they should. And so we're kind of keeping a lot of those same systems in place by not having direct relationships with our legislators where we can change how this dynamic kind of works. And I feel like I'm preaching, but I don't mean to do that, but it's kind of true.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Paula. Go ahead. Okay. Angela Davis has a great chapter in her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? Where she looks at the ways that gender structures the prison system. And so I think, when we think a lot about gender-based violence, right? We have to look at just not even like cops perpetuating abuse or violence, right? But also like the ways that policing in and of itself as an institution, how prisons and jails in and of themselves are perpetrators of gender-based violence, of gendered violence. And that's when we get into these ideas of state-sanctioned violence, right? Not to mention the realities that in prisons and jails across the US and in Oklahoma, right? The sheer number of instances of sexual violence that occurs within these structures, right? And so when we're thinking about preventing gender-based violence, when we're thinking about ending gender-based violence, we also have to think about the amount of gender-based violence that occurs within the walls of prisons and jails, and think about the ways that the sort of characteristics and culture of policing in our society mirror how we think about sort of intimate partner abuse, right? The ways that coercive tactics by the police within communities of color, policing young kids of color, or policing low-income folks, right? Coercing them into actions that they simply don't want to do, how that is also, right, gendered violence. And so this is also like a broadening our ideas of what we consider and what we believe to be gender-based violence as sort of the innate practices of policing and of how the prison and jail system in our society functions.
And then the way police officers are trained, if you look at the use of force continuum that officers pretty much around the whole United States use, especially here in Oklahoma. So on the lower end of the scale, the mere presence of a police officer is considered a level of force, because there's that influence, there's that general cultural and legal declaration to the officer, and then all the way up through deadly force. And when what they're taught is to go by the actions of the perpetrator or the resistor or the criminal. So if that person is escalates the violence, then the officer can justify using a higher level of violence. So if a guy is throwing a fist at an officer, the officer is justified, according to the use of force continuum and in the training, to take out an impact weapon, i.e. a taser, a baton, or pepper spray to be able to neutralize the attack. And then if that person has an impact weapon, especially if it's an edged weapon, then the officer can be authorized to use deadly force depending on certain circumstances. So there are situations that when someone's pulled a knife on an officer uses deadly force, or when a person has a club and goes after the officer, they've used deadly force. The mentality is the emphasis is to control the person. So the power and control is part of the training It's part of the system. And then with the idea of that it's a war on drugs, it's a war on criminals, that the officers are the soldiers, the good guys, etc., going out to wage war on the bad guys. And a lot of times, the mentality of that kind of a war seeps into the way that that supervisors and command people conduct lineups and talk or training sessions, and that just reemphasizes and continues to make officers feel afraid of the public. And there's a fine line in that has to be, teaching awareness is one thing, but teaching people to be afraid of the public, terrorizing sometimes officers. In one training that I went to, the training officer put a picture of an officer sitting, driving a police car, and it's like in first person viewpoint, and a guy running up, and he has a gun, and it's pointed at the driver right through the windshield. What are you going to do? And and these kinds of scenarios that they talk about, and then also sometimes do in kind of like acting out training scenarios, reinforce this, because officers, on a traffic stop, and you have a senior officer playing the supposed citizen / criminal, and it almost always seems that that person doing the role play will take it to higher and higher and higher level, making it seem like this is what's going to happen when you get out on the street. And I know I myself, when I first got out on the street, I was very nervous because of all that training and that reinforcement. And I think that it needs to be balanced. And so the power and control is an emphasis. I mean, they do call the training control and defensive tactics, and arguably by the way some officers abuse the use of force and use excessive force, you can argue that the defensive part of it is not as paramount, but that making sure that you're not bested. The common thing, better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. And so to be injured or to be shot on duty, the culture is weird. There is this public acknowledgement of what a great guy this was and everything, but in personal conversation, oh, he messed up. He could have done this, and he could have done this, and he could have done this, or she could have done this, or she didn't have enough fight in her. There's the background criticism. And it's that background criticism that adds to that use of force, that power and control type of use of force, in my opinion.
So the next question we'll look at, in what ways are poverty and trauma criminalized in Oklahoma?
Let's talk about drugs. A lot of my victims are victims of drug addiction. And we really have not progressed as a society yet to see this as an illness, and we criminalize that. And so I think when interacting with law enforcement, interacting with judges, I've seen this for myself, when it is clearly that you are struggling with addiction, when you have a history of stealing and to feed that addiction, you are seen as a criminal. And I don't know who that was that mentioned earlier that there's a specific mold for a victim. That victim is Gabby, who we spoke about. Cute, small, white girl. When you do not fit this mold and you come with color, you come with background, you come with socioeconomic failures, it just looks different and you are perceived different and you do have a harder time getting some kind of recourse in the system, plainly put. So that's, I mean, most of my victims have some kind of criminal history, and most of that criminal history has to do with drug addiction. And we know we can link drug addiction to poverty. So it's all connected. And that's not to say that only the poor struggle with drug addiction, but those areas, they're hit with it first. And I think that there's also a link between trying to survive and stress and anxiety, and drug being a relief for that. I mean, it's just all connected, unfortunately.
If I may for a second, I mean, definitely drugs. Like I said, I run a harm reduction program. I've dealt with so many cops asking me why I have boxes of Narcan or syringes, stuff like that on me. And every single time I met with this really shitty, well, that just sounds like it's their problem. They may as well just die type attitude. Every single time, like without fail. It's really, really pathetic. And then also talking about, sorry, my cat's wanting on the conversation too. Talking about like poverty in the situation too. I mean, YWCA-OKC comes to mind. The Black man who went to a hospital in Norman trying to get help. He was having a brain issue. I believe it was I forget exactly what it was. I'm sorry for that. But he was turned away because they thought he was drug seeking. On the police body cams, when they came to get him, they were just mocking him the entire time. They drug him across the parking lot where he died. We all know that, one thing, if he wasn't dressed like he was in poverty, and if he wasn't a Black man, he would still be alive today, most likely. So, I mean, to me, that's why, like, a huge part of where poverty plays a role in criminalization in Oklahoma. And then we also have a whole other conversation probably to have about people without housing. How, so this last winter, there was the snowstorm in February. I was out there every day with my group, making sure people have food, asking what they needed, honestly taking them cigarettes and stuff as well, because that's their main requested item, and you're freezing to death. You kind of deserve some comfort. Well, a couple of cops showed up every single day and told them, we're going to bulldoze this camp in 3 days. Got a hold of the mayor, him and the chief of police was like, no, there's no way, we'll never do that. 3 days later, the camp's gone. Now there's a fence around where the camp was. Like, that's the kind of violence that we see from the state against poor and people without housing on a regular basis. And so, of course, that's going to lead into drugs. I mean, people look for a source of comfort wherever they can find it. Because, of course, like, we mock as a society people who want to drink, who are without housing, who deserve some kind of escape, but there's no escapism to be found here for that. And it's just a vicious cycle that society perpetuates every single day.
Yeah, that's great, Rich. Thank you for all that. Just to add on like the criminalization of trauma, you know, the ways that Oklahoma has criminalized trauma responses, particularly the trauma that we know comes after being abused for some time, right? And so one big case particularly that I'm really interested in, or instance of trauma response, is that of self-defense, when survivors defend themselves against their abuser. That ends up in some sort of harm or death from that abuser, right? And how often the victim is arrested and put into prison. And so you have a number of cases that a national organization, Survived and Punished, looks at where namely Black and brown survivors defended themselves and were thrown in prison for excessive amounts of time, right? And so we have to think about self-defense as a trauma response, but then also to think about the ways that the state still views marginalized survivors, Black and brown survivors, queer and trans survivors as property. And so they don't have autonomy over their own body to defend themselves. Miriam Kaba has a really good zine that I'd recommend everybody check out called No Selves to Defend, where she talks about how Black women don't own their own body. They don't have agency or autonomy over their own body. So the idea in the eyes of police in prisons and the carceral system that they would defend themselves against their abuser doesn't calculate, right? It just doesn't work. And so we see the ways that surviving and defending yourself has been criminalized in this country and in this state, right? We have the highest rate of incarceration of people in women's facilities in the state of Oklahoma, 2/3 of which, and likely more, are survivors of gender-based violence at some point in their life, right? And so we see sort of the criminalization of survival and the criminalization of trauma, and that is deeply intertwined with the criminalization of poverty. When we think about pretrial detention in Oklahoma, and when we think about the sort of really wild amount of fines and fees that we have in the state of Oklahoma, and how fines and fees are nothing more than a tax against the poor to continue to funnel them into cycles of incarceration.
When children are involved, then I've seen a number of times when the police and the courts abuse the failure to protect statute, where sometimes a mother, there's that ideal victim, but there's also an ideal mother of what a mother is supposed to do. And it just seems like sometimes if a woman is, in the domestic abuse cycle and isn't leaving the relationship for whatever reason, then law enforcement agencies will get frustrated and charge her with failure to protect if one of the children gets severely injured or killed. And then, as we know, we've seen women under those charges get more time than the abuser themselves. And so that is a law that penalizes trauma and penalizes people caught in the cycle. So I've seen it abused. I've seen it abused among my former colleagues out of frustration because she's not acting like, she wasn't doing what they thought that a good mother should be doing.
And I see that there's some resources I will copy for everybody. But does anybody have any resources or readings, podcasts, whatever, TV shows, TikTok accounts, whatever you may use to kind of help learn a little bit more about these topics, since an hour and a half isn't nearly long enough to dive into all the intricacies of all of this?
Yeah, I would encourage folks to check out Victoria Law's work. She has, great articles as well as a great book, multiple great books, but has talked a lot about carceral feminism and talks about a lot of these intricacies and nuances. Miriam Kaba's work. Miriam Kaba has countless really accessible zines, which I love because that is needed within our communities, the accessibility piece, and podcasts. Andrea Ritchie is another really great scholar. And then I also know Interrupting Criminalization, which looks at sort of disrupting cycles of criminalization. one of the resources that I just shared is from them. Also translates all of their resources. So if you go to, like, translates them into Spanish, I should say. So if you go to the website, Interrupting Criminalization, they should have translations there.
And from also a more abstract view of all of this, but I think is extremely helpful, I discovered a podcast called Man Enough. They stream off of YouTube. One of my favorite episodes is with a philosopher and cultural commentator named Alok, who is gender nonconforming. And Alok discusses just the transcendent nature of male, female, what it means, how we decided what it meant, and how we operate as a culture. And you can see that in our criminal justice system. You can see that in the way that we handle domestic violence. And it was a very eye-opening experience for me to just kind of hear it so eloquently laid out. So I would definitely suggest that podcast as well.
I unfortunately don't have any books or podcasts necessarily to recommend for this topic, but I'd highly recommend and challenge everyone to look into basically state violence and how that leads down the road to exactly what we're talking about. Things like denying people housing, food, clean water, like the basic necessities to survive, and how that impacts rates of violence in the country.
Absolutely. Any
I'll
others?
also- Sorry, Danielle. Just resource lists are like my thing. So folks are interested, like hit up FLM, and like very happy to forward along resource lists that are tailored to your interest and like what you're wanting to know more about. Happy to engage with you on that. And on state violence, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore is amazing on that, and like Critical Resistance is an abolitionist organization that touches a lot on state violence.
And if you want to do some opposition research on what's feeding into that power and control mentality in law enforcement, there's a number of books. The Tactical Edge, Tactics for Criminal Patrol, Street Survival. And these guys go out on these tours and seminars and then scare to death out of their fellow law enforcement colleagues, one of which had been or is still the FOP president in Minneapolis, which I think that his attitude definitely contributed to the kind of abuse that we saw last year.
So oddly enough, it was actually some of those that led me to start a security company and try to keep cops out of places where I didn't think they should be, and like including community defense work, stuff like that. So fortunately, like right now, we get to patrol some mobile housing communities, things like that, and keep police out with those attitudes in those communities.
All right. Well, I do want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I do want to go ahead and wrap up, but I want to say thank you to all of our wonderful panelists again for all of your insight and all of, as Katie said, the emotional labor and sharing and your experiences and everything that your insight, all the research that you've done. And it is very fantastic and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everybody.